The focus is back on Iran, says Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This comes after Israel and Hezbollah agreed to implement a U.S.-brokered ceasefire, putting a pause to more than a year of violence that started when Hezbollah launched rockets at Israel on October 8th. The agreement means Israeli troops would withdraw from southern Lebanon and Hezbollah would pull back north of the Litani River. But what does this mean for Iran's agenda against Israel? And what about Lebanon and Syria? To help break it down for us in studio is Avi Melamed, a former Israeli intelligence officer and founder of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Avi Melamed joins us now live in studio, a former Israeli intelligence official and a former Israeli official on Arab affairs. Thank you so much for being here in studio with us.
Hello, Negan. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Avi, there's been coverage on the ceasefire, of course, but no one's really talked about the Iran angle in all of this. Hezbollah is an Iran-backed entity, so one can reasonably assume that they wouldn't have agreed to the ceasefire had it not been for Iran giving the green light. So can you start off by telling us why would Iran give the green light to this? And also, for our audience who may or may not know you, give us some background information into your career and what you've done over the years and how this can help us understand the mindset of the different players here, which is not just Lebanon and Israel. It goes beyond that.
Yes, Negan, thank you so much. Indeed, in my career, my different positions, both in intelligence and senior official on Arab affairs, I had a very close, intimate relationship with Arab communities across the region, including in Lebanon and Palestinians and others. I'm fluent in Arabic, so it was very significant in my ability to function on a daily basis and actually to interact with those communities. And one of the things that is very significant in every interaction is to understand the other side mindset and the way they look at things and perspectives they have about whatever we view as reality, because sometimes you could see that there are very different outlooks between people that are coming from a different mindset or different cultural background or historical background and so on and so on. This is actually one of the major challenges we're working with other cultures, sort of speaking, regardless of the position, whether you're intelligence or a journalist or whatever.
And you're in the field. Tell us about that.
Yes, I mean, one of my positions was operational intelligence counter-terror activities, and in that part I covered mostly the Lebanese arena. So I'm familiar with this arena, the people. I was, of course, it was a long time ago. I'm no longer holding any formal positions. Other position was in Jerusalem when I was a deputy and then senior advisor to the mayor of Jerusalem on Arab affairs, and I was doing a lot of work with the Palestinian communities in Jerusalem. Particularly during the time of the Intifada, which was a very rough times for the city of Jerusalem back in the 80s and the 90s. And I was kind of like trying to, in my different positions actually, I was trying to, whatever the mission was, of course, I was trying, of course, to operate based upon, again, this ability to interact with the people, either in the context of an intelligence work or in the context of policy making, or working with, in the case of Jerusalem, working in the context of trying to be a bridge builder between Palestinian communities and Jewish communities in Jerusalem, particularly in these very difficult times of the Intifada, or either trying to mediate between Palestinian communities and the Israeli authorities back then, basically to try and to provide Palestinian communities with services they needed. So, again, it depends on my positions because they had different tasks, but the common denominator was the ability to operate on the ground, interact with those communities, and I would say not less significant is the ability to gain the trust of the people that you're working with, which is, of course, I'm always saying that it took me a very long years of coffee and cigarettes to build the relationship.
That's the title of your next book, right? Coffee and cigarettes. Yeah.
Yeah, that could be an interesting. I had many hundreds of hours working in different arenas, interacting with the people. So, as you may understand, I'm not coming from the academic background. I'm coming from many years of hands-on operation on the ground. With, of course, lots of stories and episodes and anecdotes and unique moments.
Anything that stands out that would apply to what we're seeing today with the ceasefire?
Well, I mean, one of the things that is going back to what I said before, understanding the mindset of the people, which sometimes is very much different. And so talking particularly about the ceasefire right now, as we are talking about it today, the ceasefire is basically in effect. And one of the interesting things that I was not surprised to see was the perspective of triumph and defeat in the discussion. One of the interesting things to follow was, and I was not surprised to see that, was that when Hezbollah's people rushed following the signing of this agreement of the ceasefire, and they basically already announced victory. Many other people, of course, basically says, what victory exactly are you talking about? You have been significantly defeated. But it goes back to what I'm saying about the mindset, it's, and particularly for Western audience, because Western audience struggles to understand sometimes the way that other cultures are looking at reality, and particularly when you're talking
Very good point.
When you're talking about issues of triumph or defeat, so to speaking. It's a very elusive issue when you're talking about it from that perspective. So today, for example, I was just very quickly before our meeting, I was kind of like going over some Arab sources, and a couple of people from the region perspectives. And it was interesting to see at the same time, that some people in the Arab world are basically saying Hezbollah indeed can mark a significant achievement, while other people in the Arab world are basically saying, what achievement exactly are you talking about? I mean, this is the Hezbollah was defeated. But it's been always that story, so to speaking, I had an interesting conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, somebody from the States, a very, very wise person, head of a very big foundation. And we talked about that particular issue, the differences in mindset, and we talked about the issue, if you may recall, the final moments of the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, in Gaza Strip that were documented by a drone. And I said to him, you may be surprised to know that many in the Arab world are basically picturing that specific moment as a moment of triumph. He's sitting on this armchair and he's throwing a stick at a drone. And the person I was talking about was unable to understand that, because he was basically saying, how can they talk about it as a triumph? This is ultimate defeat in his mindset. And I said, yes, because you're thinking in English.
Yeah.
And it's a different mindset of thinking. So I think that this is one of the major lessons that I took from many years of interacting with the communities is they don't necessarily think in English. And I had always to remind myself it's a different perspectives. And for me, it's a little bit challenging, like any other person that comes from a different culture.
Keeping on that thread of mindset, why do you suppose then Iran would say, or let Hezbollah essentially agree to the ceasefire?
I think the wider context is to look what happened since following October 7. Until October 7, the Iranian regime and its proxies, what is known as the axis of resistance, they were kind of like, as far as they are concerned, they were right on the right direction, meaning sitting on the saddle and basically, the right direction, meaning moving forward with the Iranian regime vision or ambition to become the superpower in the Middle East, the hegemonic vision of the Mullah regime, moving forward with the idea of eliminating the state of Israel. But here is something interesting that happened following October 7. When Hamas launched October 7 attack, I would say that one of the major objectives that Hamas was envisioning was that will result in the destruction of the state of Israel, and that will further serve Hamas and the Mullah regime and the axis of resistance. When you look 1 year later, today, you see that actually to a large extent the opposite was happening on the ground. Hamas and Hezbollah, two major components of this axis of resistance that are backed by the Iranians, by the Mullah regime, have been significantly damaged, I would say, following the collision with Israel during that year. Iran, the Mullah regime that up until October 7 basically was safe and sound in the sense that it has no repercussion for its aggression across the region because it's using the proxies.
Plausible deniability, right?
Yeah, and also immunity, because they sustain no repercussions to their aggression. It's only, as you mentioned before accurately, they will gladly sacrifice the last Arab in the service of in the altar of their interests, of the Mullah regime. But when you look at what happened during this year, since October 7, you see that to a large extent this whole equation was totally changed. First, as I said before, the major proxies of the Iranians like Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad are substantially beaten, militarily speaking. And second, Iran itself has been basically exposed to something the Mullah regime have not experienced since the war with Iraq in the 1980s, and that is that they are now also attacked on the Iranian soil. And this is kind of like something that the cumulative impact of all those developments that happened during this last year is that it has eroded the Mullah's regime deterrence image in the region. And it's also basically forces the Mullah regime to kind of like recalculate its course. Now, this is a regime that is very sophisticated, and they know to read the map. They know to understand where the circumstances are playing in their favor and when the circumstances are not in their favor. I think that they are also taking into consideration the fact there is going to be a change of administration in the United States. Trump is going to come in. He is expected to apply even tougher sanctions on the Mullah regime. So right now, when I'm looking from a Mullah regime perspective at the situation on the ground, they're saying, okay, let's do some damage control, and hence the issue of the ceasefire in Lebanon. Because in the end of the day, we have to remember that from the Mullah's regime perspective, the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah's role in Lebanon, as far as the Mullah regime is concerned, has two major objectives. One is to secure the control of the Mullah regime in Lebanon and basically providing or enabling this power base offshore the Mediterranean Sea. And the other thing is to act as a power that will deter any possible attack on the Mullah regime. That was the two major missions of the Hezbollah as far as the Mullah regime is concerned. And the Mullah regime invested billions of dollars in Hezbollah during the last 40 years since it has established Hezbollah back in the 1980s. And right now, what happened following the war is that the Hezbollah has been substantially beaten. There is a clearly process of trying to reconfigure the reality in Lebanon in a way that will diminish the ability of Hezbollah to continue to control the Lebanese arena as it has been doing up until now, which means that it's inevitably, if it happens, it will inevitably diminish the ability of the Iranians to control the Lebanese arena. So for the Iranian regime, I would say this is a moment where they are saying, okay, we have now witnessed a change in the circumstances, not in our favor, and we need to recalculate the course. And I think that one of the recalculation of the course is actually saying, let's move towards this ceasefire. Let's do some damage control, enable Hezbollah to regroup itself, and then we'll see how to move, to continue further down the road.
Interesting. So I guess Iran, like you're saying, saw the writing was on the wall. Now they're trying to rethink of another strategy, essentially. Are there any real winners with the ceasefire, or is it, like you said, mindset and depends who you ask when you talked about triumph and defeat?
It totally depends who you ask. It's for example, the people in the Arab world who are saying to Hezbollah or Hamas, they are saying to them, what triumph are you exactly talking about? I mean, if you talk about Hamas in Gaza Strip, Hamas is beaten, Gaza Strip is destroyed. If you're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, he's severely beaten. Parts of Lebanon are ruined. There are hundreds of thousands of Lebanese refugees. So in a realistic perspective, anyone will say, what kind of defeat of triumph is that? The answer is interesting, because one answer that Hamas and Islamic and Hezbollah's leaders are saying they're using the Arabic word samidun, which means we are holding on. The fact that we were able to hold on for itself is a triumph. This is a different mindset. There is another interesting perspective that I'm sure that you're familiar with. We talk about this axis of resistance, or it's called in Arabic محور المقاومة. When you look at the story of this axis of resistance, the network of armies of terror that is backed by the Mullah regime, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shiite militias, and others, you see something very interesting. Hamas, for example, the leaders of Hamas are under, or Hezbollah, are under significant criticism by their own brothers. Hamas, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, the Lebanese, and because of what they have done and caused to their own people. The Lebanese urged Hezbollah not to drag them to this war. He dragged the Lebanese to the war against their will. Hamas inflicted an enormous destruction upon his own brothers, the Palestinians in Gaza Strip. And so when the leaders in Hezbollah or Hamas are coming under this heavy fire of criticism in the Arab world, what have you done? What have you caused to your own homelands and your own brothers and sisters? They have an interesting answer. They are saying, yes, that's correct, they say, but al-muqawama, the resistance, is alive and kicking. In other words, they refer to this thing, al-muqawama, the resistance, as if it was almost kind of like a living, breathing organism that is supposed to provide an answer or an excuse or justification to the enormous destruction that they have inflicted upon their brothers and sisters. Again, it goes back to this issue of mindset.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You reminded me of, I believe it was the Taliban that said something to the Americans along the lines of, you may have the watch, but we have the time.
Yes, that's something like that, And again, it's going back to the episode I told you about this conversation that I had with this guy in the States about the last moments of Yahya Sinwar, and I said, and he was unable to go out of the English. Couldn't
process mindset. It, right? His mind.
And it's a brilliant person. I mean, and he was like, he said, I don't understand. He says, like, Hamas is significantly beaten. Hezbollah is significantly beaten. I mean, how can they even come back to their own people and basically say, support us or identify with us or give us your trust? And I said, look, because they're saying to the people, we are a marathon runners. We are the long run, This is something that is a long run process. And when I was talking about Hamas, for example, I explained to him that I said, look, Hamas' very core of existence, the mindset, and I had meeting with people and discussions with people that were both Hamas and Hezbollah in my positions. And I was having interesting discussion with those people. And they really are coming from a place, or at least some of them are coming from a place who really basically says, look, we view the ideology that we are standing for, which is a very radical and globalist and expansionist, talking about caliphate and talking about all those things. We really view that as something that is really tangible. We really think this is something that is in overlapping or in collidence with it's manifesting the divine will. We truly believe in that. And whatever it takes to get there, it will take to get there. And that was one of the interesting episodes, for example, based upon my work back in the past, when I was sitting with those people and I started to realize back then in my early days, in my positions, that I need to understand that this is a different mindset. But it's a constant process of learning to understand that this is a different mindset. And particularly from people from the West who are, as I'm saying all the time, the region, the Middle East, doesn't think in English, doesn't necessarily think in English.
That's amazing you're able to have those experiences and to have those conversations and interactions with people who may not necessarily have the same viewpoints as you, because until you understand, like you said, the mindset of other people, then there's no really moving forward past anything, including the ceasefire, for example. Let's turn our attention now to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. After the ceasefire, he actually said, great, now I can turn my attention and my focus solely on Iran. He calls it the head of the octopus of this axis of resistance that you mentioned. What does he mean by that? Turning his focus to Iran, what does that actually entail in practice? Is it bluster, or is there going to be real action?
Well, look, the whole issue of Iran, the head of the octopus, is not something new. I mean, it has been going...
He's talked about it for 20 years now.
That has been his major flagship, sort of speaking. Not only his, by the way. Other players in the region also, the Arab states that are threatened by this Iranian ambitions and the axis of resistance, they are basically also describing Iran as the head of the octopus that needs to be, restrained. Look, Netanyahu. Again, I'm not an Israeli spokesperson. I'm not dealing with Israeli politics per se. I'm dealing with Middle East issues. But it seems to me like Netanyahu is now trying to monetize, in a way, the issue of the ceasefire, because there is, despite of the Israeli significant military achievement in the collision with Hezbollah, there is a lot of discontent within parts of the Israeli public opinion, and particularly the northern communities.
Who are without a home.
And there is a sense of sourness, to the best of my impression, because they are saying, well, Israel had a great military achievement against Hezbollah, it's very clear, but it seems like that those achievements have been wasted and not being translated into something much more decisive on the ground that really, really needs, answers the needs of Israeli communities in security. I think that Netanyahu is aware of that, because he had a very tough meeting with the heads of the municipal councils in the north yesterday or the day before yesterday. And he heard that tough criticism. And I think maybe from a political perspective, Netanyahu is kind of like trying to divert that criticism by basically refocusing on the issue of Iran, or to be more accurate, the challenge that the Mullah regime in Iran presents to Israel and to the region. I do think it's important to make the distinction between the Iranian people and the Mullah regime.
Of course.
And that's the reason I'm not saying Iran, I'm saying the Mullah regime. But in the end of the day, again, it seems to me like somebody that looks from the side and, being based upon the history of Netanyahu's political behavior, sort of speaking, it may be something that basically is motivated by its desire to divert the feelings of discontent and sourness of the northern communities against the background of the ceasefire agreement that was signed with Hezbollah. That may be an explanation for that.
Okay, so you don't foresee any real action in terms of a coalition potentially when Trump comes in to go after Iran's nuclear program?
Well, look, when you are talking about Trump, I would say that Trump will avoid a military collision with the Iranians. I don't think that Trump has an interest in that. On the other hand, I do think that Trump will continue the tough line, maybe even tougher, in terms of economic sanctions on the Mullah regime. Because it seems to me like that Trump is coming to his second term, and he's kind of like determined to say, okay, this is my second term, I want to continue things that I started in my first term, and it's about legacy as well. And in that regard, I would say that I think that one of the major guiding line, my major theme that will guide Trump, it will be the issue of like regenerating the process of an Israeli-Palestinian, I don't even to say peace, but an Israeli-Palestinian, a progress in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you go back to his first term, he was talking about this initiative that he called Peace for Prosperity. I expect him to regenerate this whole process, and now I would say that he has a better conditions to succeed in comparison to his first term, mostly because of what happened during the last year, particularly mostly because of the weakening of the Mullah regime and the axis of resistance. So I think it provides Trump a better odds of success, particularly in the context of like bringing Saudi Arabia to this whole process, which I expect
the Abraham Accords and going back to that.
The Abraham Accord and building, I don't want to say necessarily under the frame of the Abraham Accord, but in the end of the day, in the sense of like building this what we call coalition, or I call the alliance of stability, that will bring the Saudis, Israel formally together. I'm saying formally because already there is an ongoing dialogue between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's not a secret. And so I would expect that process to take place, particularly because of the shift that happened during this last year following the October 7 attack and the weakening of at least currently, the weakening of Iran and its proxies.
Speaking of Trump, some people are saying that the ceasefire is not really a deal that was brokered by President Joe Biden, and it is more a gift of Netanyahu to President Trump, who, as you said, doesn't want to get involved in wars. What is your view?
I incline to think that Netanyahu was moving towards the ceasefire for practical, real reasons. I mean, I could mention a couple of them. Like, for example, we have to remember Israel is engaged in a multi-front war for more than a year. And in the end of the day, there is a lot of fatigue. I mean, we are looking at Israeli reservists. This is the major spine of Israeli.
Many in their 40s and 50s, right? They're not.
Yes, and I mean, you know, people that have basically, I mean, think about it. Let's let our audience, the Western audience, to let it sink in. You know, imagine that you now leave your home, you leave your work, you leave your family, you are going to fight, and it has no end.
Yeah.
And, you know, you are being recruited for a period of time, and then once you're done and you survive the war, immediately the next thing that happened, you are re-recruited again to continue the fight. I mean, this is a situation, of course, when you think about, again, mindset.
Yeah, switching from emotional to military.
And I think that Netanyahu started to understand that this is becoming more and more significant issue. The other thing is we have to remember that though the Hezbollah has been significantly beaten, it is still retaining a significant military power, particularly the ability to continue and to hit Israel on a daily basis with hundreds of rockets and drones. And we should remind ourselves that was the situation until the last moment before the ceasefire came into effect. And so this is also another consideration that we have to take in mind, because this is an accumulative process on the ground, because you got millions of Israelis that their life are being interrupted, disturbed significantly, because of that challenge. I think also in terms of the logistical and military capacities, again, we have to take it into consideration. You are looking at more than 1 year.
Yeah.
You know, the army is extended to its full capacity. But there is a lot of erosion. There is a lot of so all of these things together, basically, in the end of the day, are a significant part of the reasons I think that we're pushing Netanyahu towards an arrangement. Other than that, of course, I think that also has to do with the objectives of the war. You know, the objective of the war, as it was defined by the government, was not to eliminate Hezbollah, and rightly so, because it's totally not relevant. Hezbollah is not going to disappear. The objective of the war, in the end of the day, was to enable Israelis to return back to their communities in the north and to create the conditions on the ground that in the future, Israelis communities will not be exposed to the threat that Hezbollah has been presenting. As of now, and this is the issue here, as of now, the northern communities, leaders of Israel, are not sure that this objective has been achieved, even though Israel has can mark a significant military achievement. They are not sure that this objective, meaning of bringing back the people to their home where can they live safely, they are not so sure that this objective has fully achieved. And so here is the reason for this discontent and sourness among these leaders of the northern communities. But I think there has been some significant reasons that actually pushed the Israeli government and Netanyahu to move towards this ceasefire agreement.
But it seems like the ceasefire agreement is not leading necessarily to long-lasting peace. It sounds like it's just a pause for both sides, and that includes even, as you mentioned, the Islamic Republic of Iran to re-strategize in terms of how they deal with Israel, for example.
Yes, that is very correct. Look, the key component in the end of the day for the future of both Lebanon and Israel has to do in the question whether the Lebanese will be able to restore their sovereignty that was kidnapped by the Hezbollah and the Iranians. Look, the Lebanese know for a long period of time that their country is actually kidnapped, not by Israel. They are saying openly, the Lebanese are saying Lebanon is occupied by Hezbollah in Iran. And the issue is that because of the very fractured, corrupted, ethnically based Lebanese political system, what happened was that this has been a state that suffered constantly from political instability that has been manifested in different ways. And that make it easy to Hezbollah and Iran to take over Lebanon from within. The question now is whether, following the changes that happened during this war, the Lebanese will be able to move forward in a process that will enable them to start re-establishing the sovereignty of Lebanon as a really functioning state. Lebanon is a shell. I mean, in the sense that, the situation Lebanon was until October 7 was the great situation for Iran and Hezbollah. Why? Because it was allegedly a state. It has a government, it has a president, used to have president, it has political parties and parliament, it has armed forces. It looks like a state. But actually that was a great shell that Hezbollah and Iran took advantage of. And so now there is the big question whether the Lebanese will be able to rebuild their country and their institutions and their political system in a way that could ensure that Iran and Hezbollah will not be able to continue and to dictate their agenda on the Lebanese as they have been doing up until now. It's quite clear that right now, as we said, Iran and Hezbollah would like to quickly restore their control over Lebanon. And now we are in a phase where we'll see this interesting power struggle evolving, because when you put all the triumph announcements and all the rhetoric aside, Lebanon is not the same Lebanon as it was on October 7. And the Lebanese are saying it to the Hezbollah. They're saying, we are not willing to go back to this place where you basically are the one deciding when are we going to fight and when are we going not to fight. We are done with that. So it will be interesting to see what will happen. And in that regard, I will add that an enormously significant role will be to the Western powers, and particularly Trump administration, if they could assist the Lebanese in their struggle to restore their sovereignty.
Yeah, that will also have a huge impact, not just on Israel, but on Iran as well, and its influence in the region.
Correct.
I don't know if you heard about the incident at the Lebanese airport a few weeks ago. It was with Ali Larijani. He's one of the advisors to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Apparently there was some, just to give a recap to our audience, there were some people traveling with him, part of the Iranian delegation, who refused to be checked at the airport. So then they actually shut down the entire airport and wouldn't let them go through. What does that speak to you? Does that mean that Iran's influence is starting to decrease?
Honestly, if you ask me, I'm aware of this incident, and actually I thought it was fabricated.
Interesting. And why is that?
Because it was exactly the same time we're at the peak of the anger in Lebanon on Hezbollah, because what's going on, again, we have to remind ourselves, Hezbollah launched a war on Israel on October 8th against the will of the Lebanese people. The Lebanese, begged Hezbollah, urged Hezbollah, do not drag us to this war. It's not our war. Hezbollah ignored them. So it dragged Lebanon to this war, resulting in an enormous catastrophic outcomes for Lebanese. There are hundreds of thousands of Lebanese who flee. Lebanon is already a crumbling state. And then you got a situation where the anger in Lebanon and Hezbollah is mounting. Hezbollah lost all of its senior leadership, the military and the political one, including Hassan Nasrallah.
Which was huge.
It was huge. And that was a specific phase where it was very clear that the Hezbollah is very shaky because of what happened to him, the whole story of the Beepers attack and other things. Naim Qassem, that actually came into position of leadership of the Hezbollah, was basically, it was very clear that he was totally not knowing what to do exactly. He was kind of like confused, and it was very clear that it was a situation where Hezbollah was very shaken to its core. And that was exactly the same time with the story of the delegation, the Iranian delegation, Larijani visiting the airport.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there was those reports coming from Lebanese sources that talking about the fact that they have refused to be checked, and then they had to shut down the airport. And I was thinking to myself, it seems to me too good to be true. All of a sudden the Lebanese are retrieving their lost sovereignty. All of a sudden, after all those years, where basically the airport is controlled by Hezbollah.
Really?
Yes. The Lebanese international airport is controlled by Hezbollah, like as the ports. You may remember, of course, the major disaster of the explosion in the Beirut port in 2020.
Devastating.
That disaster explosion happened because Hezbollah was storing these chemical materials in the port against the regulations, because Hezbollah is the real boss in Lebanon. And when there was an attempt to establish an inquiry committee following this disaster of the explosion in Lebanon, the Lebanese, by the way, call it Hiroshima.
Oh, wow.
The Hezbollah basically sent a very clear message: there will be no investigation. They sent a very clear intimidations. They took out at least one or two persons that were basically eliminated them, killed them, that knew a lot of things about what was going on there. So we are looking at a entity, semi-state entity, Hezbollah, that basically took control over Lebanon. So going back to the story of the airport, I was not impressed with that. I basically said it's fabricated. It's interesting because I made a public note about my observation, and I can tell you I got a lot of response from the Arab world. People who says like, you're totally right.
Interesting. And when you say Hezbollah is the boss of Lebanon, after the ceasefire, do you still see Hezbollah as the boss of Lebanon? And with your answer, would that mean also, because Iran is the boss of Hezbollah, would Iran not then be the boss of Lebanon in that sense? You still see that after the ceasefire?
Well, currently they're all in a situation of re-evaluating their position. Hezbollah is not in the same place he was in October 7. He's not in the same place. He's in a much weaker place than he was in October 7. Still, he maintained and retained power, enough power to continue and to at least try to continue and to dictate its control over Lebanon. Of course, this is the Iranian interest. However, since the circumstances changed during this last year, and particularly what happened to Hezbollah in the collision with Israel, as I said before, there is this counter-Lebanese surge that is, by the way, across the board in Lebanon, Shiites and Druze and Christians and Sunnis, who actually says to Hezbollah, we are not going back to Lebanon of October 7. We are not willing to go back. We have to have a new chapter. We cannot continue like that when you basically, Hezbollah, do whatever you want, and you impose upon us, the rest of the Lebanese, the disaster and the destruction. We are not willing to take that. So there is a change in the sense of like the positions of the sides and their might. But in the end of the day, in essence, Hezbollah still has the ability to go back to the place where he will dictate once again its will, and it's the Iranian will, upon the Lebanese people. And then goes back to the thing that I was talking about before, whether the Lebanese people will be able at this crucial moment and onwards to take advantage of the opportunity and to get free of this suffocating grip of Hezbollah in Iran.
Do you think they will?
They can't do it themselves. They need, and that goes back to what I said before, they will need this decisive, robust support of Western powers, and particularly the, I would say, a Trump administration, to help the Lebanese to take this path, to start rebuilding, reestablishing the stolen sovereignty, the kidnapped sovereignty of Lebanon that was kidnapped by Hezbollah and the Iranians. So there will be kind of like interesting milestone to see where things are going to. One milestone, for example, will be, of course, the whole issue of the what's going to happen on the ground in South Lebanon, meaning the Lebanese army announced formally they are going to deploy massively in South Lebanon, which should be the case according to the arrangement. The question, of course, what will be this nature of deployment? Is it going to be strong enough to prevent Hezbollah from rebuilding its presence in South Lebanon? So this is one milestone or one point to see how things will evolve. Another one has to do with the issue of the electing the Lebanese president. Lebanon, like the states, for example, the highest executive power in Lebanon is the president. The previous president, Michel Aoun, retired more than 2 years ago. And up until now, Lebanon does not have a president because Hezbollah was basically vetoing any candidate that they don't like to support, because the president has to be elected by the political parties. And Hezbollah had the power to veto, to impose its rejection. The name that is currently seems to be very likely to be as the most, forthcoming candidate is the chief of staff of the Lebanese army, General Aoun. which seems to be like the more one that have the best odds to become the next president. He's not Hezbollah's first choice. But it will be interesting to see whether he's going to be elected to his position. That will be some sort of like a signal of Hezbollah that is willing under those circumstances to play the game, play ball with the political system. So there will be a couple of interesting milestones to see what's the trajectory. But I think that essentially we should remind ourselves, Iran and Hezbollah, as far as they are concerned, have no intention to let go of Lebanon and to, and on the other hand, the Lebanese people are basically post this, what happened to them, because are basically in a point that are basically saying, we are not willing to go back to the place we've been before. And one interesting thing in that context is that there has been talking in Lebanon before October 7 about actually restructuring of the whole system of Lebanon and building it as a federation. Something that the Hezbollah totally oppose and rejects for obvious reasons.
Yeah, because they lose their power, yeah.
He loses power, and then he doesn't have the shell of the state to hide beyond that. So there will be, again, interesting thing to see how things will evolve in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, you see an interesting process that this whole situation also, the positive thing about this situation, it's kind of like fueled in a way a sentiment that has been always shaky within the Lebanese mindset. Going back to our conversation about mindset, and this is the whole issue of nationality. One of the keys for this success of national statehood is if the people of that frame, of that national statehood, are able to develop this common sense of national identity.
Which they definitely don't have. I mean, they always identify themselves, I'm a Christian Lebanese,
Correct.
I'm an Armenian Lebanese, I'm a
Correct.
Sunni. It's interesting,
Correct.
yeah, that you mentioned that there's not
Correct.
going to be any unity if they don't see themselves as one people.
Correct. And this is one of the things that I've noticed that kind of like has been starting to evolve, relatively speaking, in the last year as a counter-reaction to the Iranian and Hezbollah growing influence in Lebanon. Back then in 2019, the Cedar, what was the Cedar events or the Cedar revolution, when hundreds of thousands of Lebanese went out to the streets demanding Iran to get out of Lebanon. And what was interesting was it was across the board. It was Druze and Sunnis and Shiites and Christians. So it was an interesting indicator for that fueling of sense of nationalism. Talking about it in the context of Iran, for example, there has been always this inner tension between the Persian identity and the Iranian identity.
Oh, yeah. You can say that again.
Yeah,
definitely.
and this is something that in a way, of course, I'm sure that you're familiar with very well. But it's also very fascinating to look at those processes from an historical and strategic perspective.
Most definitely. And Hezbollah is not just in Lebanon, they have a presence in Syria as well. We've been reporting on at Iran International that recently there was pretty heavy strikes by the IDF in Syria, and the IDF claims that it was they were striking an Iranian smuggling route that was supplying arms to Hezbollah 4400, which is basically the body of Hezbollah that transfers the arms from Iran back into Lebanon. Are we going to see the transfer of these arms then if these routes still exist, or if the IDF hits it hard enough, could they prevent Hezbollah from resupplying their armaments?
Yes, you bring a very significant player to the discussion we didn't mention so far, and this is Syria. Syria is a very, very significant, or to be more accurate, Assad regime in Syria is a very significant component in this whole structure that the Mullah regime has been building, known as the axis of resistance. If you if the listeners could just, envision in their mindset, the map, you got Iran, and then you got Iraq, and then Syria, and then Lebanon. So the Iranian, part of the Iranian master plan is to create what we call the corridor of influence, a land corridor that actually connects Iran through Iraq, through Syria, to Lebanon, to the Mediterranean Sea. And to a large extent, the Mullah regime was able to create that land of corridor. And so one of the things that happened is that the Iraqi Shiite militias that are backed by the Iranians are transferring the weapons from Iraq through the Iraqi-Syrian border, through Syria, to Lebanon. And that has been, as you said before, the route of the smuggling or, shipments of weapons that are going to the Hezbollah and the Iranian-backed militias that are scattered now in Syria. Israel is attacking that route and those militias. By the way, Israel has been attacking that long before October 7, because Israel understood that this was part of the Iranian structure that aimed to struggle Israel from all directions. That's the reason why Israel has been attacking in Syria hundreds of times before October 7.
Indeed.
It continues to attack now, and I would expect that those attacks will continue in Syria, because as part of the understanding between Israel and the United States in the context of the ceasefire in Lebanon, one of the articles basically says that Israel has the right to continue and to intercept the shipments of armament to Lebanon, and you can expect that it will happen mostly in the Syrian territory, or the border crossing between Syria and Lebanon, and that there are major gates from which the weapon is making its way to Lebanon. But the interesting thing about Syria right now is to see the position of Assad. Assad owes its survival to Iran and the Hezbollah in Russia.
Wow.
They saved his skin in the war in Syria. But the interesting thing is to see that for the last year, particularly against the background of the Israeli-Hezbollah collision and the Israeli-Iranian collision, Assad totally remained on the sidelines. He didn't say anything.
Why?
I think that Assad is actually understanding there is a change going on.
Ah, interesting.
I think that he is kind of like, Assad is a very shrewd politician. He is a cynical politician, of course. He's a brutal dictator. And I think that he recognized shift. And he's starting to recalculate course, and he's trying to see where exactly he could benefit the best in this reconfiguration of this region. Now, we have to remind ourselves that Assad was looking for rehabilitation in the Arab world for a long period of time for what he has done to Syria and his people. And he got this rehabilitation. He was taken back to the Arab League after the membership of Syria in the Arab League was frozen back in 2011. So now he's welcome back in the Arab League.
Hezbollah too, they were recently welcomed back to the Arab League, I believe, as well.
No, there was an interesting episode where an Egyptian diplomat basically made a statement that allegedly, but that was proven to be, he was very quickly retracting.
Interesting.
Very quickly, he was retracting. Going back to Assad, once he was back into the arms of our world, his expectations are that the Saudis, the Emiratis will start fueling the huge funds needed to rehabilitate Syria. And he was hoping that through this rehabilitation in the Arab world, he will also gain international rehabilitation, and particularly in context of the relationship with the American administration. It didn't happen up until now. Though Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates basically restored their relationship with Syria to a certain extent, the money did not come in yet to Syria. And the reason for that is because they're saying to Assad, look, as long as you are part of this Iranian axis, we are not going to support you financially as you expect. Now he's facing a lot of challenges in the northern part of Syria. The Turks' involvement in Syria, Turkey is basically controlling part of northern Syria. Today, as we are talking, the rebels in Syria resumed their momentum on the ground. They reoccupied couple of villages in the area of Aleppo, in the northwest part of Syria. I think that Assad is looking at this very complex situation, and he basically, I think, trying to find what is the best way for him to move ahead in order to preserve his rule. Now, I think that Assad also, there has been accumulative information indicating that Assad is looking for ways to a little bit distance itself from the Iranian Hague. There has been a couple of milestones that indicates that, for example, following the death of the Iranian president, Raisi, in the crash of the helicopter, Assad did not attend the funeral.
You're right, he didn't.
And there has been other of milestones that indicating that Assad, there has been also indicators that the Iranians are aware of that, the Mullah regime, and they are not happy with that, of course. At some point there was reports that the Iranian president back then was visiting Syria, Raisi, and he basically kind of like made a tough demand from Assad to start paying Iran the huge funds they invested in saving Assad regime, estimated at some $50 billion.
Wow.
Assad has no intention to pay, nor ability
50
to
billion,
pay.
no.
And so it's interesting to see, I think, that the story of Syria is going to become enormously significant because it cannot be detached from the story of Lebanon. And I think that will be very interesting and very significant to follow what will happen with Assad regime and the way that it will maneuver down the road, giving to this reconfiguration of the geostrategic landscape of the region. I will definitely follow that. I am following that very closely.
Wow, it seems like the whole region is really changing and there's a big shift coming with all of this after the ceasefire. Is there any particular mission that you were on that really taught you a valuable lesson in terms of what you're seeing playing out large right now in the region?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I had a lot of interactions and different perspectives and in different circumstances with many people from different angles.
Is there one where you're like, wow, what an experience?
Again, I mean, I'm kind of like trying to think about. You know what? I'll take something from my years in my positions in Jerusalem. When I was appointed to my position as a deputy advisor to the Arab Affairs mayor, the legendary mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, and it was the summer of 1990. I was 29 years old or something like that, and I met with the mayor and he basically said, look, I heard good things about you and I welcome you in this position.
That's nice.
Yes, and it was an interesting meeting for itself. But he says, like, what do you think about the position? And I was like, I said, look, I don't know. I know that I'm entering this huge volcano. I mean, I said it and I didn't know how right I'm going to be because 2 months later was the big terrible incident of the Temple Mount where 24 Palestinians were killed and there was a lot of violence going on, and I was just right there in the middle of this whole thing. Now the interesting story was that that specific day, the background was what was going on was, you may remember, was the time of the tensions over the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait.
Yes.
Saddam Hussein, exactly that time, started the whole crisis of the Iraqi invasion to Kuwait. And there were concerns about the fact that he may use a chemical weapon against Israel.
Oh.
And so there was a discussion in Israel, and the decision of the government was to distribute to all the people in Israel a kit to defend themselves in case of chemical weapons, including, of course, the Arab population.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So these were the days of the summer of 1990. And in the very same day of the Temple Mount incident, what happened there, the very same morning, I was that day on a professional tour with the head of the emergency authority in Israel that was in charge of this whole contribution of these masks, gas masks. It's like we are talking about millions and millions of kits that has to be deployed to people and to kids and to old people. So that specific morning we were at a tour in East Jerusalem, focused on how to distribute those kits to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, because we have to find location to provide that, to have lists of the people. Somebody has to take care of all those things. So we were traveling in the neighborhood of East Jerusalem, which was my position back then, and during the tour, we were meeting with people and coordinating with the local people. Where should be the distribution points? How should we announce it to the people? What time should we come? And all those things of logistics preparations. And then while we were in this tour, I got these messages coming in I was informed that something is happening in the Temple Mount compound. I should go there. So we were in the middle of this store. We left everything and we ran to the Temple Mount compound. I'm going into the Temple Mount compound. The shooting is still going on. There is a lot of the dead bodies there, and there is a lot of smoke and people that runs away. And I went to one of there used to be a police station in the Temple Mount compound. It was burned down to the ground during that day, and next to that there was an office of the senior leadership of the Muslim administrative in the Temple Mount compound. And I went in and I saw a couple of the people there that I knew, and I knew those people. We had a lot of coffee hours, so to speak.
Of course.
And I was like, what happened? Because what happened? What happened? What's the? And I remember that one of them was like looking at me and say like, you see, we can never ever trust you.
Oh.
And I was thinking to myself, I was this morning trying to provide services to your brothers and sisters in East Jerusalem. I was doing, but it was very.
How did that make you
decisive.
feel?
I mean, look, it's. I could understand that moment. But I was saying to myself that was an interesting moment where I was kind of like divided within myself. And I didn't want back then to start talking about the issue of responsibilities and stuff like that but I think that it was one of the moments, that I clearly remember that moment, very, very clearly, specifically remember this moment. And it was particularly because of the fact that an hour before, I was traveling in those neighborhoods, basically trying to provide this service which was very much needed for the Palestinian communities in Jerusalem. So it was kind of like a very, you have these moments in life where you keep the memory very vivid.
That's one of those moments. And the issue of trust is so important. You see that especially after October 7th.
Yeah,
as well.
Definitely. The issue of trust is definitely one of those things. And by the way, I also, in a way, associated with something that is very significant when I'm meeting and talking to Western audience, particularly now against the background of October 7 and everything that happened. That I'm in almost a year mission here of educational mission to provide people with a professional understanding of what happens in the Middle East from a professional perspective, not from a political one. We are apolitical in our approach. And one of the things that I bring to the discussion, which is very significant, I'm talking about the need for, governmental accountability. And I'm saying, it's people are talking about October 7 in different aspects. You got pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis and all those things. And I said, but one thing that is absent from the discussion in the West is the issue of the governmental accountability and the need to hold Hamas, in the end of the day, as accountable for what happened to its own people. And I'm saying to people, look, in the Arab world, there is a lot of criticism on Hamas. The Arabs are holding Hamas accountable for what happened in Gaza Strip. So why are the fact that some Western circles are exempting Hamas from responsibility? By the way, also there is an interesting effort of those circles to associate the story of Lebanon and the Palestinians, even though it's totally different two issues. I'm saying to these factors, if you continue to exempt Hamas from responsibility or accountability, or exempt Hezbollah from accountability, it's only going to inflict more death and destruction upon both Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis and Lebanese. And one of the major messages that I'm bringing goes back to the issue of this episode that I'm sharing with you, was the issue of responsibility and accountability, because in that specific moment in the Temple Mount compound, I didn't want to say to this person, which I knew had a lot of a negative role in what happened that day. I didn't want to say, what about your accountability and responsibility? You are saying to me, we can't trust you. And I didn't want to push back and say, what is about your accountability and responsibility as a leader? But I didn't say that. But this was something that, and particularly now, it's kind of like connects to that in many different ways.
Yeah, very important to what's happening today. Thank you so much, Avi Melamed, for your time today. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you for coming into studio.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Regan.
Leave us a review, hit the like button, or leave a comment. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.